Good afternoon, evening everyone, and welcome to the Hunterian's Scottish Musical Tour event, organised as part of the Old Ways, New Roads exhibition series. My name is Professor Nigel Leask. You just heard me on the fiddle, supported very strongly by my two daughters, Isabel on fiddle and Flora on cello. It's serious scaffolding there. So along with Anne de Beveridge and John Bonehill, I'm exhibition curator and editor of the publication Old Ways, New Roads, Travels in Scotland, 1720 to 1832, which came out earlier this year from Berlin in association with the Hunterian. As many of you will know, the exhibition, which was due to open in the Hunterian in January of this year, has been transferred online as a result of COVID. But despite our disappointment, we're very excited to be rolling out a whole series of related events, which you can find advertised on the Hunterian's website. All our live events are being recorded and will become part of the online exhibition. So if you've enjoyed them, you'll be able to revisit them at your leisure. And please tell your friends in case they've missed any of the events and would like to see them. Our title, Old Ways, New Roads, refers to the massive project of building new roads and bridges spanning glens, rivers and mountains, part of the government's response to the dynastic and national turbulence of 18th century Scotland. Designed to replace the traditional old ways, the new roads constructed after 1720 would dramatically transform the way Scotland was perceived and experienced. Over the next century or more, a recent theatre of war became a romantic tourist destination. Travellers and visitors, women as well as men, flocked into Scotland, inspired by the poems of Ossian, by the songs of Robert Burns, by the poems and novels of Sir Walter Scott. Drawing on the output of key travellers, from soldiers, surveyors and scholars, to artists, writers and leisure tourists, Old Ways, New Roads explores the connections between military occupation, Scottish landscape, and the beginning of modern tourism as enabled by the new transport infrastructure. It's true to say that our focus is mainly on literary and visual depictions of Scotland. Travellers' fascination with scenery, with landscape, with antiquities, ruined castles, natural history and social conditions. However, perhaps the most memorable romantic response to the Scottish tour, William Wordsworth's poem, The Solitary Reaper, was written in response to music, not picturesque scenery. Wordsworth was inspired by overhearing a young woman singing a Gaelic song on the braes of Balwhidder, near the end of the Scottish tour he made with his sister Dorothy in 1803. Not having Gaelic, the English poet could only wonder at the meaning of the Reaper's plaintive numbers, as he put it. But he was deeply moved by her melody. I listened till I had my fill, and as I mounted up the hill, the music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. On that note, tonight's session is dedicated to music and the musical tour, as we'll find out a major motivation for many travellers and tourists besides Wordsworth. Three specialists in Scottish song and music of this period will offer short talks addressing some of the key personalities and events of the musical tour. The first part will last for about an hour and will be followed by half an hour's Q&A. So I'm delighted now to be joined as co-host by my friend and colleague, Kirsteen McCue, who is in the box next to me. Kirsteen is Professor of Scots Literature and Song Culture in the School of Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow. Hello, Kirsteen.
Hello, Nigel, and really lovely to be here. A warm welcome, as Nigel says, to our event this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here and wonderful of you to take the time to come along tonight. And I hope it's going to be well worth your while. Nigel and I and Anne de Beveridge, also from the Hunterian tonight, began to explore or chat about the whole idea of the Highland musical tour, or more broadly the Scottish musical tour, many months ago when this exhibition was really in its infancy. So it's particularly warming to me that we've managed to pull something together to focus on what is such a fascinating and multi-layered topic tonight. like many of you out there, I think, you may well have been here for the launch event for Old Ways, New Roads a few weeks back. But if you weren't at that event, can I just do the plug for the book? Because the book that Nigel was talking about, and I hope you can see that on my screen here, published by Berlin, is an absolute snip at 20 quid. Okay, it will brighten any spring day. There are glorious illustrations, wonderful insights from a group of top-notch scholars looking at the multifarious histories, objects, texts, paintings, and experiences associated with the Highland tour that Nigel mentioned between 1720 and 1830. So if you have a 20 quid in your back pocket, well, actually, you probably need to order it online in the current circumstances, don't you? But please do have a look out for that fabulous book, because it will give you lots more information about the topics we're discussing this evening. We are joined by two very good friends tonight, and you'll see them on your screen, I hope, if everything's working technologically at home for you. So I have the lovely task of introducing them both to you, and we're going to hear from them both shortly. But we're joined by Karen Macaulay, who specialises in mostly, many other things besides, but mostly printed music of the 18th and 19th centuries, and she is librarian at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. And next to her, either on the left or the right, depending how your tiles are working at home, is Bill Zachs, Edinburgh-based scholar and collector of mostly books and objects from the long 18th century. You're both very welcome along this evening. Thank you very much for your input, and we'll look forward to hearing from you shortly. I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about these musical travellers that Nigel was mentioning. Some of these musical travellers, and we'll hear about them this evening, sought out and collected songs in the Gaelic language or in Scots, whether they were working songs like the one that Wordsworth talks about in The Solitary Reaper that we've just heard about, or whether they were performed by tradition bearers in ceilidh houses, in local taverns, or by professional musicians in the concert halls of Scotland's towns, because during the 18th century, more formal concert making was becoming, pretty common. Edward Topham, who visited Scotland in the 1770s, also noted, and he has wonderful descriptions of this, that the Scots had a real passion for dancing. And some of them who visited Scotland would have learned about Scotland's national music from learning dance steps, notably to the fiddle or the pipes, and Mendelssohn is no exception here. So most travellers listened to the fiddle, the pipes or the harp, performing the rich repertoire of Scotland's instrumental music. Others sought inspiration for their own modern compositions from Ossianic tradition. But what's clear when you look at these accounts is that music is to be heard everywhere on and off the road through Scotland. In 1769, the Welsh traveller Thomas Pennant, who's been the focus of the recent AHRC Arts and Humanities Research Council funded Curious Travellers project that Nigel's been so closely involved with, heard Highlanders carolling fragments of Ossian as they go along. He visited the Strathearn site of the old and very popular ballad, Bessie Bell and Mary Gray, and he listened to a piper of the MacDonald chief playing what he said was a wild and tempestuous tune. Wild is often used as a term, as a word actually for describing these musical tours. Wild they certainly seem to have been. But this wild tempestuous tune that Pennant heard was based on the Battle of Harlaw, and he heard it while he was on the Isle of Skye. Serendipity is a funny thing. I've actually just been teaching the Battle of Harlaw, the ballad, to our second year Scottish literature students this week. And it's a very fine ballad indeed. A few years after Pennant, of course, Johnson and Boswell made their tour, and Johnson says he had his dinner exhilarated by the bagpipe at Dunvegan, while his companion, James Boswell, learnt by heart the Jacobite song Ha Chian Foam Ere, I'm Minded to Rise, which we've discovered was actually sung to the tune O'er the Moor Amang the Heather, which makes rather a nice link between the Highland journeys and a more lowland tradition of tunes. Nigel.
Thanks, Kirsteen. Thank you. So as you can tell from what Kirsteen's been saying, this was a golden age of Scottish music, when Robert Burns toured the Highlands and Lowlands collecting songs and breakfasted with the famous fiddler Neil Gow in Perthshire during his Highland tour. James Hogg mended and polished the ancient minstrelsy of the Scottish border and enjoyed musical experiences on his own Highland tours, while Anne Grant of Laggan smartened up her Highland laddie for the Georgian Concert Hall. As we'll hear, touring played an important part in collecting the nation's music. As with Patrick MacDonald's seminal collection of Highland music in 1784, or Alexander Campbell's ALBYN'S anthology, 1816 to 18, largely collected on an 1815 tour of the Highlands and Islands that Karen will be talking about. An 1829 Scottish tour inspired two of Felix Mendelssohn's most famous and popular orchestral works, the Overture, the Hebrides, also known as Fingal's Cave, and the Scottish Symphony, Symphony number 3. Now, let's move to the talks themselves. It's a great pleasure to introduce, I don't think I can introduce Kirsteen, given that she's already very much a presence and has been introduced, but just to remind you that Kirsteen is Professor of Scottish Literature and Song Culture, and she's also co-director of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies at the University of Glasgow. And it's really a special year for Kirsteen because her fantastic edition of Robert Burns's Songs for George Thomson has just been published as the 4th volume of the new Oxford works of Robert Burns. This is a massive amount of work. How many years did you work on this, Kirsteen?
Too many, I think.
Too many. Well, anyone who knows Kirsteen will know how hard she's been, how it's been a very, very obsessive and full-on project, hasn't it? But it's a wonderful result, and all our warmest congratulations to her for the publication of that really important volume in the study of Scottish song and Burns studies.
Thank you, Nigel.
So the title of Kirsteen's talk this evening is A Wild Affair, and there we have the word wild again that Kirsteen has commented. A Wild Affair, the Highland musical journeys of Robert Burns, James Hogg and Felix Mendelssohn.
Hello. It's perhaps obvious from the title of my presentation that I'm going to follow a 3-part structure, and I'm asking the same questions about each of our 3 travellers. Why did they want to visit the Highlands? Where did they go and with whom? And what were the musical encounters that they had? It's a little bit of a whirlwind to get through them all in a short presentation, so hang on to your hats. Part 1, Robert Burns' Highland Tour in August and September 1787. By way of an opener, it's a wee bit opportunistic of me to talk about Burns' tours when we're sitting alongside their new Oxford editor, Professor Nigel Leask, who's hosting the event tonight. And if you want to know more about these tour journals and to read more about them, then look no further than the 1st volume of the new Oxford works of Robert Burns. When Burns set out on his tours of Scotland and Northern England in 1787, he was flushed by the success of his first collection of poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, published in Kilmarnock the previous year. It was this event that literally stopped him in his tracks from going to Jamaica, hailed him a great hero, took him to Edinburgh, where a second expanded edition of poems was published the following April in 1787 by subscription, and where Burns also met James Johnson, who was just embarking on what was to be the most influential collection of Scots songs of the moment, the Scots Musical Museum. On the 7th of February 1787, Burns wrote to his patron, the Earl of Buchan, "I wished for nothing more than to make a leisurely pilgrimage through my native country, to sit and muse on those once hard contented fields where Caledonia rejoicing saw her bloody lion borne through broken ranks to victory and fame, and catching the inspiration to pour the deathless names in song. While thanking subscribers, visiting potential patrons and historic sites was important, pouring the deathless names in song was certainly a major aim for Burns." So where did he go and who went with him? Well, the main Highland tour for Burns, which you can see here, was with his companion, the schoolmaster Willie Nicol, and it covered some 600 miles. Most of the trip was by horse-drawn chaise, and you can see it here on our interactive map, which you can find online on our Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century project website. As Nigel has noted, The tour journal that Burns kept is little more really than an aide-memoire, and if you're looking for detailed descriptions and reflections, you'll be sorely disappointed, as you can see from these images of the tour journal here. This is one page that just lists places and people, and this is another more typical page which just tells you really where Burns has been and doesn't give us much detail around what he thought of the places that he visited, although you can see that he visited OSSIAN'S grave on this particular page here. When he got back in October, he wrote to his good friend John Richmond that he had visited cascades, prospects, ruins and druidical temples, that he'd learned Highland tunes and picked up Scotch songs and Jacobite anecdotes. And this suggests, as his notebooks testify, that really he was collecting objects, bits and pieces, that he was tucking away for later creative purpose. So what were Burns's musical encounters? Well, notably he met the great fiddler of the moment, Neil Gow, who you can see on the left here, on the 31st of August, the same day as he made a visit to Ossian's Hall on the River Bran. On the 10th of September, he spent some time with songwriters Andrew Shirreffs of Aberdeen and the Reverend John Skinner, seen on the right here, who was the composer of the song Tullach Gorham, which was one of Burns's favourite songs and favourite strathspeys. We're pretty sure that Burns also heard Gaelic song performed at home by Miss Ross of Killavrock and Miss Brodie of Kildrummy, but there are few descriptions of performances of any kind in the notebook, and actually we rely on other anecdotal accounts to know even what tunes Gow played for Burns. The impact of Burns's musical interests on his tours is felt most of all then after the tours themselves, and undoubtedly in the main work he undertook as a songwriter, editor and collector of two of the most influential collections of Scots songs of the moment, for the Scots Musical Museum that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and for George Thomson's select collection of original Scottish airs, totalling between them nearly 1,000 Scots songs. We can maybe talk a little bit more afterwards about what these experiences inspired in further terms. Part 2 then is pausing and looking at James Hogg's Highland tours some 15 years later. Brought up in Ettrick and the Borders, Hogg was, like Burns, born into a tenant farming family and trained as a shepherd, which you can see here by the name of his famous portrait painted during his lifetime of the Ettrick shepherd. Why did Hogg travel to the Highlands? Well, principally his journeys between 1802 and 4 were to locate a new sheep farm for his family. And I could digress here, but Hogg is really central to a major project to relocate breeds of lowland sheep which produced more wool, namely the short-haired blackface and the long-haired cheviot, to the Highlands. Demands on wool production from the Highlands by the Yorkshire woolen mills was not able to be met any longer by the native Highland breeds of sheep who just didn't produce enough wool. So the notion of a Borders family with significant shepherding experience moving their sheep to the Highlands was not so strange as it might first appear. And if you want to know more about that, and more about Hogg's journeys, I would strongly recommend that you look at Hans de Groot's work for the new Hogg edition on this. Where did Hogg go and who went with him? Well, in 1802, he set out on foot up the east coast from Ettrick through Edinburgh, and he started writing that tour really as a guidebook. But in the next 2 years, he went much further afield. He signed papers for the tenancy of a sheep farm actually on the Hebridean island of Harris beside the glorious sands of Luscantire, which at the end all came to nothing. But those journeys of 1803 and 4, which you can see here, really gave Hogg a sense of experience of the Highlands and Western Islands. You can see just how far he travelled, and what's more impressive still is that these two trips were largely made on his own and largely made on foot. Okay, so he's going much broader than the standard tour of the time. The documents from Hogg's journeys are, like Burns, a bit of a complicated mix of notes, letters and journal entries. But unlike Burns, there is evidence that Hogg was keen to have them published. We think through the friendship and support of Walter Scott. The 1802 journey appeared as a series of letters in the Scots magazine. The 1803 journey never appeared in print, but the 1804 journey likewise appeared in its entirety in the Scots magazine later in 1809. What were Hogg's musical encounters then? Well, Hogg had a fine musical ear like Burns. In 1802, he actually presents his love of music as characteristic of all Borders folks. And he notes wonderful moments in the journey where he pauses and talks about natural music around him. For example, he refers to a Dutch concert in 1803 performed by the Birds at Loch Katrine in the Trossachs, a Dutch concert akin to a céilí. Up in Loch Broom, he visits the house of George Mackenzie, where there's a dancing and a music master, and he talks about the Highlands, strathspeys and reels there. But it was later on his 1803 trip, when he reached Harris, that he first came across the strange act of singing walking songs and taking time to describe the locals in rather unfortunate terms as low and grotesque. And talking about the whole process of the walking songs as something like infernals or witches would engage in, as if in some horrible spell. I wanted to just share a little bit of that description with you, because he carries on. They perform this work sitting on the floor, ranked on each side a close-seamed flake, on which they continue all together, rubbing and rolling the cloth backwards and forwards, constantly keeping time to some of their country songs. One or more of them sing the song, and all of them join in the chorus, as the wild air swells and they all ply with increased vigour. Nor will they make a breach in the song, although the king were entering in the middle of it, and it would be much if they deigned to look whether it was him or one of their neighbours until the song was finished. Hogg's not unusual in commenting on the Gaelic tradition of walking the cloth. Thomas Pennant's 1772 tour even includes an evocative engraving of the very process. And thanks to Nigel here for sharing this engraving with me. It's in his wonderful book, Stepping Westward. But in 1804, Hogg also recalls in much more complimentary terms the Erse songs of the boatmen of Moidart, rowing him across the water, and the mellifluous singing of the Gaels of Ardnamurchan, where they're found at breakfast time singing while they cut wood. And Hogg, who's up on the hillside in Glenborradale, hears the singing, and he talks about it. He says, though their notes were wild and as we thought irregular, yet by reason of the distance and the fine echo of the woods and rocks, the effect was excellent. Now, there's no new edition of Mendelssohn's Scottish Journey, alas. It brings us on to our last journey. And a more recent web resource of this seems to be currently unavailable. But I might just draw your attention to an earlier publication by David Jenkins and Mark VOLS.I, which is a beautifully illustrated account of Mendelssohn's Scottish trip that is a very good starting place. Why did Mendelssohn want to come to Scotland and to the Highlands then? Well, having made his mark as a composer and performer of note, he was just 20 when he set out on what his biographer Peter Mercer-Taylor called his Bildungsreise, or his journey of personal development. It was actually a 2-year grand tour across Europe, and the Scottish journey was just a small part of it. Where did he go, and who went with him? Well, on his Scottish tour, he travelled with his close family friend Karl Klingemann, who you can see here. Klingemann had just left Berlin, where he frequented the Mendelssohn House, to take up the job of secretary of the Hanoverian legation in London. And just 3 months before leaving Berlin, Mendelssohn had already been in touch with Klingemann to suggest a Scottish trip. Next August, I'm going to Scotland with a rake for folk songs and an ear for the lovely fragrant countryside and a heart for the bare legs of the natives. Klingemann, you must join me. We may lead a royal life, demolish obstacles and fly to Scotland, he says. It's a great quotation there. Mendelssohn's writing is very enthusiastic. Klingemann was a budding poet, decided to write poems as they went. Felix Mendelssohn got his sketchbook out. This is one of the many beautiful sketches, pencil sketches, that he leaves behind. This is the Pass of Killiecrankie. But his chronicling of the journey was really in letters home. And the tour the boys planned was significantly different than the one they managed. Here you can see on the left-hand side the short tour that they undertook, in contrast to Johnson and Boswell's tour some 50 years earlier, which is much more circular and much longer. The German lads arrived in Edinburgh on the 28th of July, and they were back in Loch Lomond to finish their tour on the 15th of August. What about Mendelssohn's musical encounters then? Well, the first letter home to his father on the 28th of July described Edinburgh and with great excitement, a bagpipe competition which the Highlanders were hosting the next day. And he tells us a little bit more about them. With their long red beards, colourful coats and feather caps, bare knees and their bagpipes in their hand, they walked calmly past the crumbling grey castle in the meadow where Mary Stuart once lived in splendour and saw Rizzio murdered. In his letter just 2 days later, he talks again of Rizzio's murder to his father, an interesting episode that appears right at the beginning of Scott's novel The Fair Maid of Perth, which was published just the year before. And it's this that inspires Mendelssohn to think about a Scotch symphony, which he does come back to write, but not for some considerable time in 1841. His letter of the 31st of July talks about making music with Scottish musicians, Finlay Dunn and George Wood, talks about attending the bagpipe competition and learning some Scottish dances. And later on, a few days later, he talks about the wild affair of the weather at Bridge of Tummel and how affected he was by the singing of the innkeeper's wife to her baby with a sweet melody in the minor key. But Mendelssohn's musical encounters are really creative on his trip. In his letter of the 7th of August, for example, and just quoting it here as you can see, he's not able to give us a detailed prosaic description of his trip on the boat to Staffa due to ghastly seasickness, but he has managed to scribble down some musical ideas. In order to make clear what a strange mood has come over me in the Hebrides, the following occurred to me. And here you can see the beginning of Fingal's Cave or the Hebrides Overture with that lovely, in the middle there of that first stave, that lovely tune we all recognise, da 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 dum dum da 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 da, is there. He talks in this letter about his seasickness, about the damp weather, about the steam, the smokestack funnels, the Highland journeys that he's been attending, and saying the best thing he has to report that day are these lines of music. And of course, reference to the steam funnels, to the smokestack, or the steam and the smokestack funnels, draws immediate attention in our minds to Turner's wonderful painting of exactly the same trip taken just a couple of years later. Mendelssohn's Fingal's Cave or Hebrides Overture, along with his later Scotch Symphony, of course, attained tremendous success on the concert platform, both within Mendelssohn's lifetime and beyond. They're still regularly programmed today, and you often hear them on the radio, both public and commercial radio. As such, it's undeniably true that Mendelssohn's musical depiction of that moment of physical journeying to the Highlands and Western Isles has impacted broadly and deeply on notions of Scottishness beyond Scotland's borders. And taken aside the leading roles we've seen with Burns and Hogg as custodians of a national song tradition, I think the Highland Tour certainly made its musical mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsteen. That was tremendous. It was so interesting, and what a feast. I was really impressed by that drawing of the Pass of Killiecrankie by Felix Mendelssohn. He's a really good artist.
He is a brilliant artist, and actually very few of those drawings are available, but the drawings and the notebooks are all held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and there are some really beautiful drawings. I mean, you know, there's some fantastic waterfalls and other beautiful scenes, and some very very sketchy sketches of other elements of the Hebrides and heading out as well. But that's one of the only ones that's really available to share online at the moment. But yeah, he's a really talented artist.
Yeah, multi-talented, as they say.
Oh yes. Oh yeah.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I'm sure it will raise questions that we'll come to in a few minutes. But first of all, before that, it's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Karen Macaulay. Karen is a librarian and postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. She's worked on 2 HRC funded projects, first of them investigating bass culture in Scottish fiddle music, then founding a research network for early British legal deposit music. Her 2009 PhD thesis led to a book entitled Our Ancient National Airs, Scottish Song Collecting from the Enlightenment to the Romantic Era, published by Ashgate in 2013. It's a really excellent and important study of the Scottish musical tour. I greatly recommend it to you. And I believe she's currently planning a second monograph. Well, looking forward to that, Karen. So the title of Karen's talk this evening is The Classic Ground of Our Celtic Homer, Alexander Campbell's Song Collecting Tour.
Hello, my name is Dr. Karen Macaulay of the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and today I'm going to talk to you about song collector Alexander Campbell. I'll just start by sharing my screen with you. Alexander Campbell was the compiler of the two-volume ALBYN'S anthology published in 1816 and 1818. He based his collections largely on the tour that he made of the Highlands and Islands in search of Scottish traditional songs in 1815. He covered most of his journey on foot, apart, of course, from ferries and rowing boats between the isles. In 2008, whilst I was completing my doctoral thesis on historical Scottish song collecting, I was invited to go and talk about Campbell to the young traditional musicians at Plockton Centre of Excellence for Traditional Music. To get the whole Alexander Campbell experience, I'd have liked to have taken those young musicians outdoors into untamed countryside with the rain pouring down, a rough footpath under their feet, probably no map, and certainly no mobile phone. However, Plockton was sunny that day and I only had an hour before lunch on a Sunday morning. The best I could do was ask them to use their imaginations as I shared the story of Alexander Campbell. And I ask you likewise to exercise your imagination today. Campbell has been described as Scotland's first ethnomusicologist. This may not be strictly true. After all, Joseph MacDonald compiled his collection a good half-century earlier, but Campbell was the first on record to expend such physical effort on his collection. Originally from Tomby, northwest of Callander, he was proud to call himself a Highlander and a Gaelic speaker. By the time he reached adulthood, he had moved to Edinburgh and had singing lessons with Tenducci, the famous Italian singer. A music teacher and organist, Campbell also wrote about Scottish poetry and places, studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, but never seems to have been a doctor, and once made what has been described as a financially disastrous venture into farming. He knew of the Highland clearances and in 1804 published a long poem called the Grampians Desolate, in which he complained about the plight of the Highlanders. This book-length poem was a fundraiser for a charity that he set up, and here's a modern edition of the book itself. That whole book is one poem. So here's the advertisement about his charity, and you see right at the end of it, it's for the Fund of Aid for Wasteland Cultivators. At what he considered the old age of 51, Campbell embarked on a song collecting tour of the Highlands and Western Isles. It was a long-held ambition. He had told the antiquarian Joseph Ritson about his dream as far back as 1792. Whilst we know that personal circumstances delayed his ability to make the tour until 1815, we don't know why he chose to set out on a 3-month trip in late July, when anyone who knows Scottish summers would have thought it better to set off in May. Campbell kept a detailed diary of his trip, calling it a slight sketch of a journey made through parts of the Highlands and Hebrides, and I'll be telling you about some of the highlights of his trip in this brief talk. So he began. On the 23rd of July, 1815, I took my place as an outside passenger on the mail coach to Stirling. On my arrival there, I armed and apparelled myself in the ancient costume of my native mountains and set forward for LANRICK Castle. Although he sometimes had company, just as often we find him tramping around in the mud, falling down hills, or slipping into streams all alone. He hurt his leg quite badly more than once, but rested for a day or so and then moved on. Towards the end of his trip, he was plainly getting tired and fed up, but his spirits did seem to lift on the homeward stretch. A true man of his era and an artist, Campbell's journal also notes when he was impressed by a particularly spectacular view, and in this respect he referenced an influential writer, Edmund Burke, who had written a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. Let's pause to meet a couple of influential Scotsmen. 50 years before Campbell's tour, the Gaelic-speaking poet James MACPHERSON published the works of Ossian, the son of Fingal, in 1765. His poetry was in English, but he claimed to have translated it all from the Gaelic, having gathered together and reconstructed ancient Gaelic poems and fragments by the bard Ossian, all about Fingal and his heroic exploits. Fingal was said to have roamed the Highlands in and around the 3rd century, and the poems were mainly handed down orally from generation to generation. MacPherson said he collected his materials from Highlanders encountered during his own poem collecting tour. This is a modern edition of some of his poems. I'll just show you some of it.
Autumn is dark on the mountains, grey mist rests on the hills, the whirlwind is heard on the heath. Dark rolls the river through the narrow plain. A tree stands alone on the hill and marks the grave of Connell. The leaves whirl round with the wind and strew the grave of the dead. At times are seen the ghosts of the deceased when the musing hunter alone stalks slowly over the heath. And let's have a quick look at the preface while we're here. Where it reads, "The public may depend on the following fragments as genuine remains of ancient Scottish poetry. The date of their composition cannot be exactly ascertained. Tradition in the country where they were written refers to them to an era of the most remote antiquity."
Highland society, indeed people all over Scotland, England and Europe, went crazy about these poems, retranslating them into other languages and even much later on, back into Gaelic. It was stirring stuff about rugged mountains, misty glens, stormy weather and turbulent streams with plenty of heroic exploits. Only 7 years after the works of Ossian was published, explorer Louis Albert Necker de Saussure discovered, I should put that in inverted commas, the caves on Staffa, and was told that they were the caves of Fingal. On a practical level, tourism as an industry can be said to have started around this time, and literally hundreds of tour guides were being written. The association of the caves with the great Ossianic hero fanned the flames of interest in the Hebridean Isles. Travel writers were enchanted with the romance and the grandeur of the caves, particularly with the echo effect in Fingal's cave. Travellers would take their own piper with them by boat to hear the sound resonate around the caves. Back in 2008, I recreated this trip with my reluctant family, only to discover a little boy playing Highland Cathedral on the accordion. It didn't feel quite the same. Literary experts were unconvinced that the poems were genuine. After Macpherson's death, the Highland Society of Scotland began an inquiry, members travelling to the Highlands and Islands attempting to meet the people who had given Macpherson his original Gaelic poems. Amidst the growing interest in Scottish poetry and songs in general, Campbell was anxious to preserve his heritage, first writing a book about Scottish poetry, then a travel guide, long before he started his song collection. His introduction to the history of poetry in Scotland appeared in 1798-9, where, believing the Ossian poems to be genuine, he wrote a chapter defending them, arguably less harsh a judge than some of the experts in the Highland Society of Scotland. His tour guide journey from Edinburgh through parts of North Britain followed in 1802. Here are my own copies. Campbell's real ambition was to compile a collection of Highland songs, and he asked the Highland Society of Scotland to help finance this. The Society did provide the funds, but they stressed that they were not commissioning research, merely helping to fund his trip. Campbell was fortunate that an influential member of the nobility helped him to plan his itinerary. Sir John MacGregor Murray, a committed member of the Highland Society of Scotland, had already been instrumental in getting an early collection of Highland tunes published, the Patrick MacDonald Collection, which has a correct title of Highland Vocal Airs, Country Dances or Reels of the North Highlands and Western Isles, published in 1784. Significantly, MacGregor Murray had been amongst the individuals visiting the Highlands and the Western Isles in 1800, trying to trace the sources of Macpherson's epic verses. Sir John already had had an illustrious career with the East India Company. He had also become clan chieftain of the MacGregors and had petitioned to have the prescription of the MacGregor name lifted. So he was undoubtedly a gentleman of both determination and position. But if there was one prevailing and notable characteristic about Sir John, it was his predilection for recording histories and cultures. He spent much time researching his own family history, and whilst in India, he commissioned MUNSHIs to write lengthy manuscripts for the East India Company about customs and procedures in the regions where he was stationed. At that time, he also raised funds to finance a Gaelic edition of the Ossian Tales, but legal means were subsequently used to recover the funds from the deceased MACPHERSON's family, since the author failed to produce a Gaelic translation. At any event, you can see that Sir John MacGregor Murray had his finger in quite a lot of pies, all connected with record keeping or cultural history. By the time Campbell met him, he was old and had retired to LANRICK Castle, north of Stirling, where he was able to indulge his passions for the Gaelic language and Highland culture, and to become even more involved with the Highland societies of Scotland and London. In 1815, Campbell began his journey by visiting LANRICK Castle, where Sir John wrote a number of letters for him, introducing him to knowledgeable people on Mull, Staffa, Benbecula, North and South Uist and Skye. Without help, Campbell would have had much more difficulty getting to meet the right people. Staying overnight, Campbell set off for Stirling the next day, and Sir John, unsurprisingly, set off to judge a piping competition in Edinburgh under the auspices of the Highland Society of Scotland. Starting in Stirling in Perthshire, Campbell went westward to the Argyllshire coast, travelling from Connell near Oban to the Isles of Lismore, Mull and Iona. He went by boat from Tobermory at the northern tip of Mull to North Uist, travelled to South Uist and the Isles of Barrow and Fattersay before returning to North Uist. From here he headed for the Isle of Harris, going by the tiny Isle of Killigrew on his way to Skye. His island hopping took in Raasay and Scalpay before he headed back for the mainland, arriving at Glenelg, some 55 miles due north of Connell. Note that he didn't go near Lewis, probably because James McPherson hadn't done so. Neither had Johnson and Boswell, who were amongst the first to try to retrace his steps, and neither, we think, did Sir John MacGregor Murray. Glengarry, Inverlochy, near Fort William, Ballachulish and Inverurin marked Campbell's return to Stirlingshire, and he stopped off again at LANRICK Castle to show off his collection to Sir John. Then he walked to Stirling and took the mail coach home to Edinburgh. Now, sometimes Campbell stayed with the people that he met, and other times he stayed at inns. One night he was stuck for a bed and ended up sleeping on a bundle of hay in a weaver's cottage. Additionally, without modern communication methods, he couldn't be sure the people he was visiting would be at home when he got there. On one occasion, he found that the clergyman host had gone out, and Campbell was very grateful for a stiff drink of cognac when eventually the minister came home. Living in times when class distinction was much greater than anything we've ever come across, Campbell was clearly happy to mix with people of all ranks of society. He met a lot of people who were quite comfortably off, as well as church ministers and a few priests, the people Sir John MacGregor Murray would have met. At pre-arranged gatherings, Campbell met people who would perform for him, or individuals would be sent for in order for him to take down tunes. He went to dances, dinners, social evenings, and listened to all kinds of people singing songs and reciting poems: gentry and military men, servants and field workers, boatmen, a weaver, a cabinet maker, besides amateur violinists and various pipers. He too was treated to the effect of Staffa's piper playing the Lament for the Slain in the FINGAL'S cave. He even met a man who played an instrument that Campbell called a Jew's harp. It's also known as a jaw harp or a trump. A diligent networker, he made people promise to forward any extra information they could get hold of. In 1815, as now, traditional musicians set great store by the history of the tunes that they performed. Campbell encountered an old man who was the 22nd male representative of the McCue family, formerly the hereditary bards to the family of Clanranald. And another time, he collected songs from the grandson of MacCodrum, whom he called the celebrated bard of North Uist. Bagpipe music was transcribed from Captain Neil MacLeod of Gesto, who had learned it from the MacCrimmons of Skye. Campbell also heard brilliant piping by the elderly Lieutenant Donald MacCrimmon, the 11th in succession of the MacCrimmons of Skye. He collected harp music, which came indirectly from Murdoch MacDonald, the last harper to the Laird of Cole, who had died 76 years previously. These were transcribed, from whom Campbell does not say, by Margaret Clefane, who was away in Edinburgh getting married to the Marquis of Compton whilst Campbell was in the Hebrides. Campbell observed that harp music could still be heard in the Highlands and Western Isles. Indeed, he said he had heard young ladies playing an improved harp. Campbell wished that harp music could be revived and the ancient order of harpers re-established in Scotland. However, part of his enjoyment of the harp was purely aesthetic. He thought young ladies' figures were best displayed to advantage when playing the harp. Growing more selective as time went by, he spent one particular evening listening to a weaver singing song after song, luniac after luniac, interspersed with many stories of considerable length and various merit. Most of the pieces I had heard repeatedly in Lochaber and other Highland districts. Campbell gathered fiddle music, pipe tunes, harp airs, and tunes that he described as pretty national melodies, sometimes played on the piano. The collection included short songs, ancient love songs, rowing songs, and mouth music sung in place of instrumental music for dancing. There was also Gaelic poetry, some of which Campbell declared to be Ossianic fragments, later writing down of tracing the steps of our Celtic Homer, in other words, Ossian the Bard. For each piece that he took down, he then repeated them back to the performer or the people he was staying with to authenticate them, and there's no mention of him carrying an instrument. After 1 month, Campbell noted that in Mull he had gleaned 47 original melodies, mostly vocal, with a stanza or two of the original words to each. 12 months after his return to Edinburgh, he was to make another music collecting tour to the Scottish borders in October 1816, again logging the trip. However, this tour was curtailed by illness after 3 weeks. He had covered a circle roughly defined by the borders towns of Peebles, Ettrick, Hoyk, Jedburgh and Melrose, and spent time with James Hogg and Sir Walter Scott, who was in fact a former pupil of his, beside taking detailed notes about famous borders pipers from Sir Walter Scott's uncle, Mr. Thomas Scott. The second volume of ALBYN'S anthology was not meant to be the final one. He never published the intended third volume. His collections met with a mixed reception and did not achieve a great popularity, probably due to the fact that his arrangements left much to be desired. Campbell tried to write simple classical song settings, but it's fair to say that traditional modal melodies can be harder to harmonize than you might think. He sometimes broke some of the most basic harmony rules that were commonly learnt in those days, rules you might expect him to have encountered if he was working as a professional musician. This raises questions about his level of musicianship and also about how many lessons he actually had with Tenducci. Tenducci himself had had a chorister's training in Italy and was undoubtedly highly musically educated. Nonetheless, Campbell knew what he was looking for, believed he could spot an authentic Highland melody, and thought he could tell the difference between a Highland and a Lowland melody. Indeed, he did preserve a lot of songs that might otherwise have been forgotten. From a musical point of view, the tunes make good source material, and musicians nowadays make their own settings of them. This is the book itself, dedication to His Royal Highness. There's a lengthy preface in which he talks about modes, poetry, some earlier printed collections. And I'll just let it scroll through a bit further. So this takes us to the end of the preface, where you see he's mentioned 1,200 miles, and in amongst the people he thanks, we've got Sir John MacGregor Murray. Then he has a contents page, which has got the name of the song, the author of the words, and the name of the air, in other words, the tune. And then I'll just show you one of the songs as well. As you see, it's got Gaelic above and English in the middle. And it ends with a little coda for the instrument on its own without the voice. And then we've got words in English as well as in Gaelic. A few footnotes this time about different words, but sometimes it says where he got it from. Then we've got the whole Gaelic poem. Notwithstanding the dubious nature of his harmonizations, the publications and the travelogue's significance lie in telling us where Campbell went and his methodology. He left an intriguing piece of social history, demonstrating the depth of this particular Highlander's love for his homeland, its traditions, and its heritage. I'm just going to play you an excerpt from that tune that we were looking at. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you. So wonderful presentation. It always just strikes me how much of an unsung hero good old Alexander Campbell is. He just has so many fingers and so many pies, and you've done so much wonderful work to open up that journal for us and to open up his work for us, and working with that manuscript material too, which is at Edinburgh University, isn't it? In
Yes,
their
that's right.
special collections. It's worth me just saying, folks, that Karen's wonderful monograph here, which is called Our Ancient National Airs, Scottish Song Collecting from the Enlightenment to the Romantic Era, has a third chapter very much focusing on the work of Alexander Campbell. So if you're interested in reading more. And Karen and I worked recently on a Royal Society of Edinburgh funded network called the Romantic National Song Network. And she did a wonderful blog for that website for us on Campbell's collecting, particularly important because he's one of the very first to collect Gaelic song and to print both text and music for Gaelic song. So really important. And I think Rachel or somebody might pop up a little connection in the chat box for you guys if you want to have a look at that and follow up that link. Karen, thanks very much indeed. Can I just take the opportunity to remind people that we're looking for questions for coming back to a little bit of a discussion after the next and our final presentation this evening. And if you have a question, can you just pop it in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen? You'll see it down in the middle of your screens at home. Please feel free to type your question in there and we'll come back to it shortly. Thanks, Karen. So this brings us on to our final presentation this evening. I want to introduce you again to Bill Zachs, who I mentioned or introduced you to earlier. He's a scholar and collector. Bill runs a private research centre right in the centre of Edinburgh's Old Town, and we're about to be welcomed into that wonderful space in just a couple of minutes' time. He has an exhibition there at the moment called Beethoven, Burns and the Scottish Folk Song. And if you're interested in visiting the exhibition virtually, then you're able to do so. And I think we'll hear more about how we can do that after Bill's presentation. Bill's an honorary fellow of the University of Edinburgh. He's published several books and articles and exhibition catalogues. But it's worth me also saying that he's been instrumental, excuse the pun, in helping many of us here at Glasgow, especially on our Robert Burns project, by generously sharing his wonderful collection, which has some very special items in it, with us. So we are very grateful to Bill and much value his friendship. But without further ado, he's going to show us some of these wonderful objects just now, with a little bit of a specific nod to the musical tour. Bill, sit back and enjoy, everybody.
Welcome to Blackie House, a 17th century tenement in the lawn market of the old town of Edinburgh, and the home of my library and current exhibition, Beethoven, Burns, and the Scottish Folk Song. The gentleman looming behind me is called George Thompson, and he was the publisher and music impresario who over a 50-year period brought together the tradition of Scottish and other national folk songs with the compositions of such great composers as Beethoven, Joseph Haydn, and others. Burns collaborated with Thompson, his principal collaborator, until his death in 1796. Beethoven took on the project about 10 years later and produced 180 folk song arrangements for the piano, violin, cello, and different voices. An alternative title for this exhibition, although it was already taken, might have been Old Ways, New Roads, because the theme of the old ways, the traditional Scottish folk songs, and the new roads, the Viennese classical school of music, of which Haydn, Mozart, of course, although he didn't make it to this project or to Scotland, sadly, and Beethoven were the principal figures in that, although there were several others, of course. What got me interested in this project was this: a 25-page musical autograph in the hand of Ludwig van Beethoven. It contains the arrangements for those instruments, as I said, piano, cello, violin, and voices, of 5 of these folk songs arrangements. One of them, called Highland Harry, or Oh, For Him Back Again, included the words by Robert Burns. Burns produced over 100 texts for Thompson during the period which he was involved with this project. And as I said, Beethoven 180. And in several instances, these two great figures came together through the agency of Thompson on the page. Before we talk a little bit more about this exhibition and share with you some of the highlights, particularly as they relate to a musical tour, even if it's a musical tour, metaphorically speaking, in print, in the musical compositions which Thompson published, I'd like to share with you one item in my collection that is, I think, characteristic of the period and brings together those themes. Here, in the Thomas Rowlandson caricatures illustrating Boswell's Journal of a Tour to the Hebrides, that tour, of course, which he took with Samuel Johnson in 1773. Here is Boswell dancing a Highland fling on the top of Duncanna, the hill on Raasay, accompanied by the bagpiper. We can't know for sure what tune was being played, no doubt several, but we can hear in our mind's ear, so to speak, the music that would have been heard at the time by Boswell and that inspired him to dance the jig that he did. We're now going to jump to the music and listen to that arrangement that Beethoven made of Burns' text, Highland Harry, a Jacobite song that harked back to a period of the Jacobite rebellions and to that romantic world of the Highlands. As I take the camera and guide it over the autograph manuscript, you'll see Beethoven's characteristic, frenetic, creative process. His indecision, his harmonies, his all of that energy that we know and characterizes Beethoven. I will also move the camera to the engraved versions published by Thomson so that you can see both before and after for this piece. Now, we'll also shift over to the song, and hopefully the technology will keep us going. Here we have Highland Harry.
My Harry was a gallant gay who stayed his treaty on the plain, but now he's vanished far away. I'll never see him back again. Oh, for him back again! Oh, for him back again! What Guiana cast his blood for Highland Harry back again. When all the leaves into their bed, I wandered dowly up the glen. I sat me down and greet me fill, and I wish him back again. Oh, for him back again! Oh, for him back again! What Guiana cast his blood for Highland Harry back again. Oh, where some villains hung it high, and ilka body had their ain, then I might see the joyful sight, my Highland Harry back again. Oh, for him back again! Oh, for him back again! What Guiana cast his blood for Highland Harry back again.
As you can see, the scene behind me has shifted. We are in the second part of the exhibition, the story of Beethoven and Scotland and the story of Robert Burns and the folk song tradition, a broad topic indeed. The quirky item behind me is 1800 years old, it's believed. It's what's known as a Celtic head, and to my mind, this is perhaps as close as we can come to a depiction of that ubiquitous and important character in the story of Scotland's history, Ossian. Ossian, the 3rd century bard, who came to prominence in particular in about 1760, when the man behind him, James McPherson, poet, politician, questionable figure in some respects, but he produced in 1760 this little book, Fragments of Ancient Poetry, collected in the Highlands of Scotland and translated from the Gaelic or Erse language. This was short 80-page pamphlet, was the beginning of a phenomenon which was to take over as if it was millions of followers on Instagram. Ludwig van Beethoven was one of those followers, and he came to Ossian through several different channels. One was a translation into German that was published a few years after McPherson's important publications, and a few years before Beethoven's birth, in fact. Johann Goethe was an important figure. You see him over on the side there with Beethoven, whose novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, incorporated line after line of Ossian's poetry and affected not just Beethoven, but so many others. Beethoven's strong desire was to visit Scotland, and indeed England as well, as had Haydn and Mozart before him. But his tour, his Highland tour, took a musical form instead through the agency, as we've suggested, of George Thomson. Robert Burns, of course, went on his own tours around Scotland, brilliantly edited by Nigel Leask in the Glasgow Oxford edition. And this volume here is the very document in which Burns recorded his border tour. This is a privately owned document on loan to this exhibition and seen in public for the very first time in about 150 years. In the 57 pages, we see Burns traversing the countryside, visiting those locations where so many of the folk songs had been first originated. Meeting a woman called Esther, a very remarkable woman for reciting poetry of all kinds, and sometimes making Scotch doggerel herself. And he goes on to describe this lovely woman, the wife of a gardener nearby. Another tour of importance shown in this exhibition, and rarely seen, is an album in the hand of a less well-known figure, a musical tutor to the Dukes of Buccleuch's children in the early 19th century, called Montague Corey. He was the son of prominent Italian emigres to Edinburgh who had set up musical rooms and performances and published the Scottish folk tradition. I'm just going to take the camera off here, and hopefully you'll be able to see this album. 12 ancient Highland melodies, collected from thence and the Western Isles, arranged and adapted for the pianoforte in the style of simplicity suitable to their peculiar character, by Montague Corey. And what's fascinating about this document is the context and the anecdotes which Corey provides for the origins of the songs. I obtained this air, he says, by hearing it repeated by a female voice in the neighborhood of Cromarty. Shortly after, I perceived the singer, a girl who was bringing a net from a boat. I hastily descended the cliff, there's always a cliff, in order to overtake her, under the hope of obtaining some other melody from her voice, or at least getting her to repeat the above. But before I could reach the seashore, she had disappeared, like a mermaid. I've added that. And as the evening was fast closing in, I did not prosecute my search. And then the second song, then you see the song written out here for the pianoforte, Adagio Expressive. And then number 2, a Highland March, crossing a chain bridge. There you see an example of a new kind of road in the Highlands, which formed a communication between two precipices. I heard the notes of a Highland pipe. The distance softened the discordance of its tone and rendered the effect rather pleasing. On looking down, I observed in the glen beneath me a kind of rustic procession led by a piper. It appeared that a marriage had taken place, and that this was the wedding party returning from it. I lost no time in taking down the melody, but have never been able to ascertain its name, and thus he calls it a Highland March. In this short time, I have only been able to give you a glimpse of the musical tour in this exhibition, and more generally in my collection. It's my hope that you will be able to visit this exhibition in real time before too long, and if anyone would like to come on a lengthier virtual tour, we can make arrangements for that following this session. I'd like to conclude now while I play the other arrangement by Beethoven of Burns' O for Him Back Again, Highland Harry turned into the Highlander's Lament, the only song, I believe, which Beethoven arranged on 2 occasions for Thompson. While I do that, I will show you various other items from the exhibition, and we'll conclude as the song ends. And I'll say thank you very much in advance and look forward to any questions you might have. Here you see the modern edition of the Highlander's Lament, an arrangement which was not published by Thompson and did not appear until this edition, edited by Petra Weber-Buchholz, appeared in 1999. The arrangements, as I noted, for pianoforte, violin, cello, and 2 voices, here now being sung by Janice Watson and Timothy Robertson. In this edition of the 180 Beethoven arrangements in 7 CDs, available from Deutsche Grammophon. Some of the other items in the exhibition that tell the broader story of the Scottish folk song tradition. An early work from the first part of the 18th century, Watson's Choice Collection, where there are early versions of Auld Lang Syne and other songs. Allan Ramsay's works, of course, feature in this, and the work of him and William Thompson, the Orpheus Caledonius, another source book like Watson's Choice Collection for Thompson and for James Johnson and Robert Burns, who produce that important 6-volume set, the Scots Musical Museum, so brilliantly edited recently for the Glasgow Oxford edition by Murray Piddock. Here you see a special early issue of that work. You can see the copy dedicated to the Catch Club, a group of Edinburgh men who sang and met regularly. And here, their very own copy, one of 3 from the collection. Another example is in that tradition is a work by Pietro Albani, one of those other Italian emigres to Edinburgh, who changed the musical landscape of Scotland. This wonderful title page of Scots songs, which included an early appearance, the first set to music of Burns' famous poem, perhaps his most famous song, The Red, Red Rose, appearing in 1794. Here, a later edition of the final volume, volume 6 of Thompson's project, published in 1841, and appearing for the first time, that publication, that arrangement rather, of Highland Harry, not till nearly 40 years after Burns' death did that song appear with Beethoven's arrangement. The first appearance of Beethoven's works for Thompson in this 5th volume of the select collection of original Scottish airs. A copy in the original printed boards. So many other items, but let's just listen to the rest of the Highlander's Lament.
Before we end, I'd just like to thank Kirsteen and Karen and Bill for those tremendous 3 tremendous talks. It's been incredibly illuminating and interesting, and I think we all understand the Scottish musical tour a lot better after your talks. So thank you very much, and I do hope that we will continue this conversation in the future. So perhaps I'll just hand over before we go. Just hand over to Kirsteen, who's going to say a final word.
No, just to reiterate, underline, thanks to a few other people actually, Nigel, to the Hunterian, to Andela Beveridge, who is here this evening in the background, and especially to Rachel Hughes, who's been really in charge of all the technical pyrotechnics tonight in the background. We don't, with these Zoom kind of webinars, we don't really see what goes on behind the scenes, and quite a lot actually goes on behind the scenes to make one of these kinds of events happen. So we just want to say a very warm thanks to all of them. But most of all, our warmest thanks to all of you for joining us this evening in such huge numbers. We hope you've learned a little bit more about the Highland Tour tour, the Highland musical tour. I think there might be more to say in the future on that. If we haven't managed to answer questions, or you have questions after the event, please look us up. Please email us, and to keep the conversation going, we'd be very happy to get specific queries to Bill or Karen or for myself or Nigel to answer. And of course, remember that you can buy that book for just 20 and find out much more about old ways and new roads, much more to say on that. So if you're still interested, then do look that up. But thanks very much for joining us, and we wish you all a very pleasant evening ahead.